This is Channel 2 Boston, public television for New England. Local broadcast of the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is made possible by a grant from the Bank of Boston and by contributions from you, our viewers.
Good evening. These are the day's top news headlines. The city of Philadelphia promised to rebuild a neighborhood destroyed by fire set off by a police bomb. Secretary of State Schultz and Foreign Minister Gromyko met in Vienna. America's Catholic bishop said the threat to family farmers is a threat to the nation's food supply. In Sri Lanka, separatist guerrillas killed at least 78 people in a raid on a bus stop. Jim?
On the NewsHour tonight, the Schultz-Gromyko meeting in Vienna is the subject of our lead focus segment. Then comes another on the latest in the violent Philadelphia story, and a third on the fight between Ford and Chrysler over fuel efficiency standards.
The MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is funded by AT&T, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and this station and other public television stations.
Philadelphia's Mayor Wilson Goode said today the city will pay for the 60 houses destroyed last night in a fire started by a police bomb. The fire destroyed a middle-class neighborhood of row houses in western Philadelphia after a police gun battle with a radical group called MOVE, who had fortified one of the houses. A state police helicopter dropped a bomb on the house to open a hole through which police could throw tear gas to immobilize the MOVE members. Some 150 police officers surrounded the house, but the MOVE members were not accounted for. Then, late today, police found 2 bodies in the ashes of the MOVE headquarters. At a news conference, the mayor emphasized that the fire was not intentional.
We have to understand that we had a well-thought-out plan. The plan was to try and prevent the loss of life. That plan proceeded according to the well-laid-out plan. The one thing that we did not anticipate that went wrong was when the percussion grenade was dropped. It caused a fire. Now, that was an accident. No one could have known that. And I am as saddened by that as anyone else.
Later in the program, we have an extended report from Philadelphia by Charlene Hunter-Gault, followed by analysis of the police action. Jim?
Secretary of State Schultz today was the guest who came for a 3-hour visit and stayed for 6. His host was Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, and the two talked for twice the scheduled time at the Soviet embassy in Vienna. Nobody would say afterward why the meeting went longer than expected, or if that was a good or bad sign. Schultz and Gromyko greeted each other cordially in a conference room at the Soviet embassy. Later, TASS, the Soviet news agency, said Gromyko insisted that any agreement in the Geneva arms talks must cover the American Star Wars defense system, which Moscow opposes. Schultz said only that the talk was useful and devoted mostly to arms control in general and the Geneva talks in particular. Soviet experts Richard Starr and Marshall Schulman will explore the meanings and purposes of the Schultz-Gromyko meeting later in the program.
In South Africa, a black township called Sakani in the Eastern Cape province was the scene of a dramatic funeral today. The deceased was a union leader who died shortly after he'd been questioned by the police. Here's a report from Michael Burke of the BBC.
The ugly wound that caused Andreas Raditzella's death showed on his forehead as he lay in state before the funeral, mourned by his wife and young family in his township home. The unions here blame the authorities, say he was grievously assaulted while in detention. Sympathizers are thought responsible for a series of bombings early this morning in the White Town next door. One went off in police quarters, 2 more in court buildings. Nobody was hurt, but the damage was fairly extensive. The police and army sent great convoys of reinforcements to Sakani. They'd been asked to stay away from the funeral to avoid trouble, but their presence was close and continual. Armoured vehicles circled the church in a show of force that some mourners called provocation. By the time the service was over, the crowd was the largest anybody could recall, even for such a controversial funeral. 50,000 people streamed from the church to the graveyard. Andreas Radicella was borne to the grave, bobbing on a tide of mourners that swamped his township. The interment was simple and brief, a call for freedom, a word of sympathy for his widow. Then he was buried, but not forgotten. He's now a focus for the burgeoning resentments in South Africa.
In Sri Lanka, at least 78 people died and some 100 were wounded when separatist guerrillas staged a raid on a bus stop. Men, women, children, and Buddhist monks and nuns were reported killed in the attack about 120 miles north of Colombo, the capital. The guerrillas were members of the Tamil-speaking minority agitating for their own state.
On the economic front, new retail sales figures out today showed a 0.9% increase last month, which was read by some economists as a sign the economy is reviving again. And the big three auto companies lined up 2 against 1 today on lowering federal fuel economy standards. General Motors and Ford want mileage standards relaxed, lest they be fined for not meeting them. A Transportation Department official indicated today the administration favors the GM Ford position. Chrysler, which can meet them, wants them left alone. A Chrysler spokesman laid out the issue before a Senate subcommittee this way.
I'm very suspicious about the circumstances for this 11th hour appeal because we have taken the actions to invest in new technology. I would cite sports cars as an example where we sell turbo 4s while the competition is selling V8s. Now, we get the performance, but has it come at very high cost of engineering development and retooling our factories, scrapping V8 capacity in order to comply with the law. The thing that's going to come out here is that our 2 competitors flunked the test, and we're going to end up paying the fine. And that's why we're pretty excited about what's going on here.
Our final focus segment tonight will look at this controversy with representatives of Ford and Chrysler.
Representatives of America's Roman Catholic bishops said today that losing American family farms could be a major threat to the food supply. The statement was in addition to the wide-ranging statement on the U.S. economy issued last November. In a draft agricultural chapter, a 5-bishop committee appealed for quick and substantial federal help and a reversal of what they called emphasis on government aid for giant agricultural corporations. The draft said, at risk are the food necessary for life, the land and water resources needed to produce that food, and the way of life of the people who make the land productive.
It was supposed to last only 3 hours, but it went for 6. What did Secretary of State Schultz and Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko talk about for all that time in Vienna today? Does it mean there are summit meetings and other warming things ahead between the United States and the Soviet Union? Well, we're going to talk about all of that now in our first focus segment with 2 Soviet experts who see the situation somewhat differently. They are Marshall Schulman, director of Columbia University's Harriman Institute for Advanced Study of the Soviet Union. He served as a special Soviet affairs advisor to the State Department during the Carter administration. And Richard Starr, former U.S. negotiator at Mutual and Balanced Force Reduction talks in 1981 and 83, now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He joins us tonight from San Francisco. Mr. Starr, is a Reagan-Gorbachev summit pretty much inevitable now?
Well, this is hard to say. Certainly during that 6-hour conversation between our Secretary of State and the Soviet Foreign Minister, the possibility of a summit must have been raised. We know, for example, that both President Reagan and Secretary General Gorbachev have indicated a positive attitude toward a summit, but I think we'll just have to wait until the communique is issued.
Mr. Schulman, you have any reading on that?
My guess, Jim, is that it's on. And what awaits is further consultation between the 2 governments, and then will come the leaks, and then will come the public announcement.
Mr. Schulman, do you think it's a good thing for these 2 men to meet?
I think so, Jim. It seems to me that it would make sense if the heads of state of these 2 powerful countries would meet regularly on a routine basis without high expectations.
Mr. Starr, what's your view of the goodness of such a meeting?
Well, if we look back into history, there have been 13 summits, 3 of them during the Second World War, and unless a summit is prepared very thoroughly in advance, I think it can be a dangerous thing. I'll give you one example. When former President Kennedy went to Vienna to meet with Mr. Khrushchev, and Khrushchev attempted to bully the president, and I recall that 2 misjudgments resulted from that, namely the ultimatum which the Soviets issued over Berlin, precipitating an alert of our forces, and then finally, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Mr. Schulman, do you see any risks at all in a summit meeting?
Sure, there are risks involved in the relationship, and the summit meeting tends to bring to a head a lot of issues. But there are also risks in not having meetings, and risks now especially in going into a period in which the negotiations of Geneva are deadlocked. There is a total irreconcilability of the position of the 2 countries. That's a risk too.
According to the reports that I just saw, that is what was basically the main agenda item there today. Whether they went in to talk about it for the whole 6 hours, apparently that's what they talked about the whole time.
Well, they had a lot of bilateral issues to talk about too, but I think the most urgent thing they have to talk about is whether or not they can manage the level of competition in nuclear weapons. Now, there are a lot of other things going on. There are secondary issues, like the consulates, like the issue of Major Nicholson, like the trade relations. The Secretary Baldrige is going to Moscow this month. The Russians want to know what the level of trade is that we're ready to take, whether we'll open up 2 new consulates in each other's countries, whether we'll grant Aeroflot landing rights again in return for a guarantee the safety of airliners. All those things have to be talked about. But the most important issue, without a doubt, is whether or not we're going to be able to manage the nuclear military competition, or whether we're heading into a period in which that is going to go up on both sides.
Do you think that unless there is a meeting, or unless there's some kind of breakthrough, or I started to say meeting of the minds, or at least a breakthrough in Geneva, that we are going to go the competitive route?
Without a doubt. You see, what is an obstacle, as Gromyko's spokesman said after the meeting today, is that if the United States persists in going into a period of intensified research on the exotic technologies involved in space-based defense, the Soviets feel they have no alternative but to raise the number of their missiles and of their warheads, to do countermeasures, and to do space research of their own. Now, we're both doing research now, and there's no question about our stopping research. The question is whether we go on at our present level, which this year amounts to $1.4 billion a year, and the Soviets are doing about the same, or whether we intensify it. The proposal is that we increase it for next year by 160%. And not only that, but we change the character of it. We intensify the research on the exotic technologies, the lasers in space and the particle beams and all that.
Mr. Starr, what is your reading of what the stumbling block is, and particularly as it applies to SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative?
Well, I think most of what we heard are minor issues which should not take up the time of chiefs of state. Now, obviously, the last point should be discussed by the 2 heads of government if there is indeed a summit. I would like to point out that the Soviet Union, despite the fact that their Minister of Defense, Marshal Sokolov, specifically denied this about a week ago, we know, and the Department of State issued a statement to that effect, they have 2 operational lasers, ground-based, high-energy lasers with anti-satellite capabilities. So they're accusing us of trying to develop what they already have. And of course, this is typical of Soviet statements. I'll give you another example, Mr. Gorbachev's address exactly a week ago. If you compare that with President Reagan's address on the same day, the 8th of May, it's like night and day. Mr. Gorbachev was accusing the United States of being on the cutting edge of a nuclear war. that the ruling circles of the United States wish to dominate the world, and so on and so forth. Well, all of this, of course, it reminded me of Stalin's speech on the 9th of February 1946, when he said that they will need another 4 or 5 year plans in order to be prepared for another war.
You believe, in other words,
yes.
you disagree with Mr. Schulman that the United States is not playing this thing wrong. It's the Soviet Union that's at fault, correct?
That's right, exactly. I disagree completely with Professor Schulman.
Yeah. Mr. Schulman, do you read something in what Gorbachev has said or done since he's become the leader of the Soviet Union that he really does want to improve relations with the United States?
Yes, I think so, Jim. First, let me say that I have a lot of respect for Dick Starr. I've known him for a long time, but I disagree completely with his reading of the situation. I'd like to go back to what he said for a moment before I answer your question. It is true that both we and the Russians have been doing research for a long time at a high level on anti-satellite techniques and on anti-ballistic missiles. What they have done is really crude, very primitive. It's not a justification for our going into the pushing the pace of the technology in lasers or in other anti-satellite systems. It would make much more sense from our point of view to reach an agreement to put a moratorium on anti-satellite weapons, because we're so much more dependent on them than the Russians are for navigation, for communications, for everything else. Now, back to your question about Gorbachev. It's very interesting what he's been saying, Jim. And he's been developing a rather consistent pattern even before he became First Secretary. The primary emphasis he puts is on the modernization of the Soviet economy. And he's been very blunt and very practical about all the crudities, the bureaucratization, all the lack of incentives for initiative and innovation. And he says we've got to remedy this. So this is his big emphasis. Now that naturally makes him interested in improving relations with the United States, because if relations go down, and if we're both going to be operating at a higher level, a still higher level of military competition, it means he's going to have to put into the military sector the computers, the alloys, the scientists, the labs, all those things that he needs for his technology.
All right. Mr. Starr, you agree with that?
To a certain extent, yes. On the other hand, if we go back to the summit, which we started talking about, it seems to me that Mr. Gorbachev needs the summit more than President Reagan. He has not consolidated his position. It's true that a few days ago, 3 of his protégés, really Mr. Andropov's protégés, have joined the Politburo, and that he presumably has a majority now of 8 out of 13. However, it will take him several years before he actually becomes de facto #1, not in just name only. And I think that during this period of weakness, certainly he's going to need better relations with the United States. But again, when we talk about a summit, I recall 30 years ago, today in Vienna, the State Treaty was signed. Well, Mr. Khrushchev needed a summit. He wanted it badly. And this was one of the reasons why, of course, he decided, or his colleagues on the Politburo decided, that the Soviets would withdraw their troops from Austria.
You think maybe then that the Reagan administration should go cautiously and even agreeing to a summit, because they may be playing into Gorbachev's hands and making him even stronger, where it may turn around and hurt us in the long run?
Well, that would be my attitude, and I think if we look at the vituperation, which is apparent in almost every sentence in that speech I referred to on the 8th of May in Moscow, we see that, that this man is so not just anti-American, anti-West, anti-capitalist. He calls us imperialists. If you look at Soviet literature, they refer to us as the main enemy, Glavny Vrak in Russian. And I don't know that a summit at this point would actually bring about better relations. We would be, in effect, capitulating, giving them something that they want, and receiving absolutely nothing in return.
Dr. Schulman, you see it very differently on the summit and on Gorbachev's attitude, correct?
Yeah, I do, Jim. You know, it may be that Gorbachev needs a summit more than we do. I don't think that's the interesting question. The real question is, what kind of a relationship do we want? What kind of a relationship is in our interest? Gorbachev is no softy. He's not going to be easy to deal with. He's got his own self-interest. He does regard us as imperialists. Mr. Starr is right about that. But the question is, what do we want, a relationship of confrontation, or do we want to manage the nuclear military competition in a more sensible way?
All right. Marshal Shulman, Richard Starr, thank you both very much. Robin?
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, Charlene Hunter-Galt has a report from Philadelphia, and then we talk to two Philadelphians about the fire, and we focus on the dispute between Ford and Chrysler over fuel efficiency standards. Section. For our next focus section, we go back to the extraordinary story in Philadelphia of a police action that turned to disaster. A neighborhood wiped out by fire started in a police attempt to subdue heavily armed members of a radical group known as MOVE. They had barricaded themselves in a steel-lined bunker on top of a row house in western Philadelphia and fought a gun battle with police. Charlene Hunter-Galt picks up the story in Philadelphia.
The beginning of the end came last night at about 5:30 when a state police helicopter dropped a bomb on the rooftop bunker. It was not long before smoke and flames engulfed the house and later the neighborhood. Firemen were reportedly held off until the flames could destroy the bunker. When they did approach the house, the mayor said today they were driven back by gunfire from 4 MOVE members in the alley. Some children were taken from the house, but it is still unclear how many bodies remain trapped inside. By the time the fire was arrested, some 60 houses had been ravaged, most of them totally destroyed. The area was cordoned off and being handled by police as a crime scene today, with only residents allowed to cross the barricades. As the residents filtered in to assess the damage and began the cleanup, a police SWAT team was still searching the area for MOVE members, some of whom are believed to be hiding in a network of tunnels leading from the now destroyed house. This was not the first confrontation with MOVE, as Asel Moore, a columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, recalled today.
The last incident, which resulted in a shootout, the Philadelphia police officer lost his life, resulted in the jailing of about 15 MOVE members. They are obviously a revolutionary organization. They are fanatical, radical group that whose even sanitation and lifestyle is objective to most anyone who lives in an urban setting. They have been called a back to nature group by virtue of the fact that at previous and other compounds they've thrown garbage into the backyard and let it rot. They have defecated in buckets in their homes. They live with stray dogs and cats and rodents. They have even eaten raw meat.
You said also that they blast.
Residents of the area said they were glad to be rid of MOVE, but questioned the price they had to pay. To discuss that price and the situation, we have the Philadelphia Police Commissioner, Gregory Sambor, who personally authorized the bomb dropping on the house, and Thatcher Longstreth, a member of the Republican minority on the Philadelphia City Council. Commissioner Sambor, first of all, in view of what happened now, do you think there was a better way to have done this?
We tried to look at every other option, to use mechanical equipment, cranes, but none of them could meet our objectives of eliminating the MOVE members from maintaining a tactical advantage from the rooftops. And as a last resort to eliminate the continued use of that vantage point to shoot at police officers and to prevent any loss of life to police officers and fire personnel, it was determined that we would use this alternative step to remove the object and also to gain access into the property.
How much did you know about the nature of the bomb that was used when you authorized its use?
I knew the strength of it. I knew what it was capable of doing. And contrary to public opinion and popular opinion, it was not primarily an incendiary device. It was an an explosive device improvised by our bomb unit to dismantle the bunker and also to be utilized at the same time to gain entry into the roof.
The local head of the American Civil Liberties Union, Burton Kane, said today that trained public safety officials should have known that the dropping of a bomb into a row home full of ammunition and other explosives in a tightly compacted area is like lighting a match in a room full of gas. What is your response to that?
I think that's an irresponsible statement. I think that it is based on conjecture. It is not based on fact. The individual, unless he had been in the move house, would not know anything about the conditions in that house, nor as to whether or not it was in fact in a compact area. There is nothing that we can determine from the operation itself or from any information that we were able to gather that there was anything near the roof. As a matter of fact, information that has been determined subsequent to this event indicates that the majority of anything inflammable or otherwise was in the basement. We also have information to the extent that that inflammables were thrown over the roof by the MOVE members, which in our estimation provided the input. Secondly of all...
You mean that's what really started the fires, is it?
The incendiary, that is correct. And it did not start, in other words, the helicopter that circled over after the object was dropped did not notice fire immediately, and there was no fire immediately. The fire started from inside and immediately below the roof, not on the roof. So this further supports our contention that it is a result of incendiary material that was placed there by the MOVE members.
I see. Let's turn to City Councilman Longstreth. What is your view of how this was handled, sir?
Well, I think the major criticism that should be leveled at the administration relates not essentially to the police action of last night as much as it does over the 6 months previously when MOVE was fortifying the House when they were not paying their bills, not abiding by regulations, where they were indicating very clearly that the same procedure which had taken place in 1978 was going to be repeated again in 1985. And I think the unwillingness of the administration to confront them in any way at all, until forced to do so by the neighbors of MOVE out in the Osage Avenue area, is the most serious single criticism that I would level at the mayor and his forces.
Well, was that a subject that came up in City Council? Were people urging the mayor to do something about it?
No, it did not come up in City Council. It really isn't something that relates to City Council, something that relates to the chief executive and his right to do these kinds of things. I think it's quite obvious he knew about it, and somebody had told city authorities to lay off the MOVE people because they were getting away with things that the ordinary citizen couldn't do, and they were getting away with it over a period of many months.
Commissioner, just let me go back to the commissioner for a second. Commissioner Sambor, were the police urging the mayor to let you take action and against the MOVE people earlier?
Well, it is not a matter of urging. The mayor was informed and it was a consensus that at the time that this was originally discussed, that the violations were primarily of a minor nature, of a summary nature, and that the felonies and misdemeanors that were later placed on the warrants for their arrest, which we served yesterday, were determined as a result of investigations and their subsequent action in the immediate past.
You mean you wouldn't have had the law on your side to have moved earlier? Is that what you mean?
We would not have had the felonies and misdemeanors to move against them as we did at this final stage earlier on, and to risk what we considered legitimately from all the available intelligence, as was already enunciated by Mr. Asa Moore, that these people were zealots, they were radical, they were prepared to fight. The circumstances that erupted yesterday confirmed our suspicions that this potential existed. And to go against them for violations of sanitation, not paying a gas bill or anything else such as has been enunciated, in our estimation was not worth the tactical exercise or the potential loss of life.
Councilman Longstreth, what's your view?
Well, in other words, the MOVE people had frightened the administration out of taking the ordinary disciplinary steps that would be taken against the ordinary citizens. There are two factors here that are very important, I think. One is that we really, in terms of actual taking action against the MOVE people, we didn't take that action until the citizens of that area demanded it. And I'm afraid that this is fairly typical of the way in which Mayor Good runs Philadelphia. He moves only when there's a real confrontation and a real crisis, and it's government by crisis.
How do you suggest, Councilman Longstreth, that the MOVE people had frightened the city into not taking action?
Well, if you had anything to do with the MOVE people, you'd understand what a confrontation with them is like. They're the most unreasonable group of people I've seen. They're heavily armed. There had been an incident in 1978 which occurred in the death of a police officer. There was every reason for the police to be very concerned about what was taking place there. The thing I can't understand is when the MOVE people started to build their fortress on the roof, and if I did that in my home, I'd have license and inspections in there in 5 minutes wanting to know what I was doing. They were allowed to go ahead with this, and it wasn't until the mayor was confronted with the citizens there that he took the necessary action. I might add also two very important points. One, I believe that it was a great mistake for the police to authorize the use of that weapon, knowing as little about it as they did. Obviously, they were wrong. It was an incendiary weapon. I have seen the explosions in the television, and it is hard for me to believe that they resulted from inflammables that were thrown up on the roof by the MOVE people. Second thing is that having done this, there should have been fire equipment there with water to throw on immediately and prevent that conflagration from spreading as rapidly as it did.
Commissioner Sanborn?
First of all, it is not an incendiary device. Secondly of all, as I stated, that we do have information that tells us that the MOVE people did pour inflammable mixture on the rooftops. Thirdly of all, relative to taking the action and in an unsupported manner, it was, again I reiterate, the last alternative to prevent continued loss of life. Relative to the fire.
Yeah, what about the councilman's point, Commissioner, that that they had the administration scared because they were going ahead with they were heavily armed, going ahead with their fortification, and nothing was done about it, whereas he says ordinary people would have been required to have a permit to do that kind of structure and so on.
Well, whether I can't answer that question as opposed, because that does not come within the purview of the police department, and we would only act in support of other city departments responsible for this type of enforcement. However, if I may return to the statement made relative to the fire, we did place water into the area. We were attempting to keep the fire under control. We had the fire under control, and the only reason that it got out of control is because the MOVE personnel again began to fire at the police, so that as a result, we withdrew the fire forces to remove any danger of them being killed or seriously injured.
Councilman Longstreth?
There's another point I'd like to make, and again, my major criticism goes back to the slowness with which this whole thing was faced up to over a period of months. The district attorney told the mayor, I think a year ago, that there was every legal reason to take action against the MOVE people at that time. I think that it put a terrible strain and pressure upon the police force that they were not asked to move until so late in the game that they were faced with a very, very difficult task. However, I really find it very difficult to accept the fact that this bomb, which was a percussion bomb, the whole concept was that it would stun people in the fortress and allow the police to make an entrance, I think very proper if the weapon had worked, had not been properly evaluated. And the very fact that it turned out to be incendiary, it certainly set a fire, and the fire grew rapidly and destroyed 60 houses, says, I think, enough on the improper judgment that was used in the evaluation of this particular weapon in this particular place.
You had not evaluated the explosive beforehand, Commissioner?
Oh, yes. Yes, we had, and it is not normally, and it was not expected, and in previous tests did not provide us with the serious concern of a fire that such as what resulted.
Can we move on to what happens now? The latest report, while we've been on the air with this program, has been that you have now found 4 bodies in the remains of those houses. How many MOVE members do you believe you were fighting against, and what's happened to them?
We have no idea how many MOVE members were in the residence, and we do not have any idea as to how many were adults and how many were children. Our best estimates from intelligence sources is that there were possibly 8 adults and possibly as many as 6 or 8 children that could have been in that property. However, they have 2 other properties in Philadelphia, and they also had a property in Chester. Now, there was an incident in which arrests were made in Chester, and there were either 4 or 6 children taken into custody at that site.
Is that today?
That was yesterday.
Yesterday.
That was yesterday. In addition, there is 1 child that is in our custody. So, and we don't know about the other 2 houses. So there is no way that we can actually give a figure. There were rumors of tunnels. When the excavations are completed, we may be able to more definitively ascertain as to whether those rumors and the intelligence received about the construction of tunnels was true. I might point out that the incidents of yesterday tended to support that there was some type of tunnel or cave structures inside the building, because after the building had burned, the fire officials were certain that there was no one that was left alive in that building, and it was after that that the 4 people came out and again began firing at the police officers. So where they came from and how they escaped the fire is still a question that has to be determined.
So at this moment, you don't know how many are still at large or how many may be dead in the buildings?
Well, we know that there are people in the other MOVE buildings, just who they are, and as a determination of what happens if we can make identifications of those bodies that have been found to date, then we will make a determination as to whether anybody for whom we have warrants is still possibly alive and in hiding, as to what moves we will make, and that will be after discussion with the district attorney and our other legal sources as to what action will be taken in the immediate future.
Finally, just one more quick question. Do you, beyond the branch in Chester, do you know of any other branches in other cities of this MOVE movement?
No, I do not know of any other branches. However, I do know that there are sympathizers in several cities, because we have from time to time received correspondence from them down south, further west, even to the north. But to my knowledge, there are no other compounds, as they prefer to call them, in any other cities except ours.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Sambor and Councilman Longstreth. Jim?
Finally tonight, should the federal government relax the gas mileage standards that United States automakers now have to meet? One of the big 3 says strongly no, the other 2 say yes, and the Reagan administration today hinted that it agrees with them. Judy Woodruff has the story. Judy?
That's right, Jim. As we reported earlier, the head of the National Highway Safety Agency told a congressional committee today the Reagan administration believes the best way to achieve fuel economy is through the free market and not through standards set by the government. If that is any indication of what the administration will do, it comes as good news to Ford and General Motors, which want the government to lower fuel efficiency standards for cars, but not such good news for Chrysler, which, along with several consumer groups, is arguing that the government should maintain strict fuel standards. Neither Ford nor GM say they will be able to meet the higher standard for their 1986 model cars, which is 27.5 miles a gallon, while Chrysler says that it will. At today's hearing before a Senate subcommittee, testimony centered on whether Ford and GM have done enough to build and sell smaller, more fuel-efficient cars.
Certainly, the American public has not been forced to buy those larger cars. In fact, very often, We have been caught short in the sense that we have seen that we could have sold more of the larger cars or cars with the larger engines if we'd had them available. We haven't had that small problem with small cars, sir.
Part of the point that you seem to be missing in my part is that you can sell the large cars, but you could have done things to make them fuel efficient.
Our large cars indeed are far more fuel efficient than they were. In fact, our largest cars today are more fuel efficient than most of our compact cars were 10 years ago.
The biggest single factor in both Ford and GM being below 27.5 is that they chose to retain outmoded, old-fashioned big cars. The reason why they kept these cars, it has nothing to do with consumer demand, it has to do with profits. These cars are virtual cash cows. The tooling and other investments have long since been written off, and they're making at least an additional $1,500 per car profit.
For more on the debate about fuel efficiency, we talk with Helen Petrauskas, a vice president with the Ford Motor Company. She also testified on Capitol Hill today, and she joins us from PBS station WTVS in Detroit. Ms. Petrauskas, we've had these fuel efficiency standards now in place for some years. Why is it that Ford isn't able to meet them?
The only reason we're having difficulty meeting the standard is because consumers are buying full-size cars in much larger numbers than the government predicted they would 10 years ago. It's really an issue of consumer choice. Do we, as a nation, want to establish a policy that restricts the availability of full-sized cars, even though those cars have fuel economy that's better than the smallest car we built 10 years ago?
Well, as you know, your critics are saying that Ford and General Motors, for that matter, that neither one of you have done enough to promote the smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, that you're pushing the big cars, which are more profitable.
Oh, Judy, that's just absolutely wrong. You know, during the period 1982 to 1985, we had almost 100 programs, and by that I mean marketing programs, incentive programs of all kinds, each of which had one purpose, and that was to try to persuade consumers to buy a more fuel economical product than one they might have otherwise chosen. And you know, the cost of those programs was $600 million.
So your point is that you did all you could?
Well, not only from the standpoint of merchandising, but also from the standpoint of technology. And by that I mean, if you go back and look at the predictions that the government made as to the technological progress that would be made, how much weight do we remove, how much do we improve aerodynamics, for example. In every single one of those categories, we can prove that we spent the money and put the technology in place.
Well, if that's the case, why is it that Chrysler is able to meet them and doesn't want the standards rolled back?
I think the principal difference between Chrysler and Ford and General Motors, on the other hand, is the fact that Chrysler is not a full-line manufacturer. And by that I mean they don't produce full-size cars, they don't produce full-size station wagons. And when I say full-sized, I mean I'm using the EPA index, cars that are capable of towing a heavy trailer, cars that are capable of seating 6 passengers.
What will you do, what will Ford do if you don't get this rollback that you're asking for?
I think we will make every effort to minimize the restrictions on the products that we sell. Our concern, of course, is that we may not be able to eliminate that risk entirely.
I'm sorry, you said you will try to minimize?
What we'd like to do is minimize the extent to which we have to tell consumers they can't have a car that they want to buy. We also want to minimize the economic impact, not only in terms of our own employees, but our dealers, who of course are heavily dependent on the sale of these cars. But you know what, I'm sorry, go ahead.
What are you suggesting? You said you want to minimize the impact on your customers and your deal. Are you saying what? That
we will look very hard. Look, we don't want to sit here and say we're threatening job losses. we are saying that unless the standard is amended, there's a substantial risk that that would occur. Look, in the final analysis, we're asking for only one thing, and that is Congress establish some ground rules. Please give the Department of Transportation the opportunity to evaluate our case in light of those ground rules. I think if I understood Chrysler's testimony this morning, they don't want NHTSA to go through that fact-finding process.
Stay there, Ms. Petrauskas. We'll be right back to you. For a very different view from a rival automaker, we talk with Robert Miller, an executive vice president with the Chrysler Corporation. Mr. Miller also testified before Congress today. He's back in Detroit tonight, and he's joining us also from public station WTVS. Mr. Miller, why is Chrysler opposing any rollback in the standards?
We're opposing the rollback in the standards for the simple reason that, in the first place, to roll back the standards, it has to be shown that it's technologically not feasible to make the standards. Chrysler started out in 1978 as the worst in terms of vehicle weight and fuel economy. We're now the best. We made it, and therefore I think we've proven that it's technologically feasible. It's unfair to us at this time to change the law just 90 days before the 1986 model year production run begins, when it's far too late to make changes. We spent $5 billion changing over our product line to meet this law, and we expect it to stay in place.
Well, what about the argument that you just heard Ms. Petrauskas make, that Chrysler doesn't make a full line of cars, you don't make as many big-size cars as your competitors do, that's what consumers are asking for, and therefore they ought to be permitted to get them?
We've got vehicles in our showrooms for every kind of buyer. We have a luxury car called the Fifth Avenue that we kept in production because that's what the customer wanted, but we provided the average fuel economy across our range in order to meet the law.
Well, but still, again, her point is that if consumers want the bigger cars, why shouldn't they get them? And if that means the fuel standards can't be met or can't be met on time, they ought to be extended.
Well, let's talk about that. What Chrysler has done is to make the additional investments in high technology in order to get the fuel economy that the customers would like to have. Let me just show you one thing I brought with me. Here's an ad from yesterday's Wall Street Journal. It says, at this rate, you could be driving in luxury. This is an ad by the Ford Motor Company for their luxury cars. Now, they're trying to tell the Congress that the public is beating down their door to get luxury cars. That's not true. They're having to advertise to sell them. That's because they're going for profits instead of trying to make the best effort to meet the law.
Well, Ms. Petrauskas, let me bring you back in at that point. How do you respond to Mr. Miller's point?
I'd like to borrow the same ad, because what this ad illustrates is exactly what I was talking about. We have bigger luxury cars than the two that are shown here, and that's our Lincoln Town Car. Now, if you have a customer that's in the market for a luxury car, you're not going to talk him into buying a compact, but you may be able to convince him to try one of our mid-size luxury cars, and that's exactly what this ad illustrates.
Mr. Miller?
I still think it comes down to this. Ford has said that they have the capacity to meet the law for 1986. They have the capacity in place. So what we're talking about is whether they're going to take the marketing actions in order to adjust their production mix to meet the law that's on the books. And therefore, it's technologically feasible, and that's all that the administration is asked to judge. If we're going to change the policy in Washington, that's a matter for the Congress to undertake so that we can hear from all the people of America where we're going to throw overboard all of our fuel conservation measures and go back to the big fuel-efficient vehicles.
You're shaking your head, Ms. Petrauskas.
Look, for somebody who's in the automobile business, assured energy supplies is pretty critical, and nobody's suggesting throwing fuel conservation overboard. All we're saying is give us the opportunity before the Department of Transportation to show that the only reason we're not meeting the standard is because of factors beyond our control. Now, surely no one can disagree that that fact-finding ought not happen.
Well, but what about the larger point, though, here, that even though we don't have a fuel crisis now, we may have one, we may have a fuel shortage at some point down the road, and the only prudent thing to do is to be ready for it now and do all we can to get the standards lower, or rather higher.
But you know, that is a very important point. But let me cite one statistic to you, if I may, and that is, today we have the capacity to build 1.5 million four-cylinder engine, very fuel-efficient engines. Now, that's about 500,000 more than we're able to sell today. Take our Escort Lynx vehicle, most efficient vehicle we build. We're building at about 80% of the capacity that we have. Now, what that says, if the market were to change tomorrow suddenly, or even gradually, we're in the position to respond to it. And that's the big difference that we have today in 1985 as opposed to the situation we had in 1975 when this law was enacted.
Mr. Miller, can you respond?
I'm not quite sure what market they're trying to sell to. We just announced last week that we're putting in a $150 million new investment in four-cylinder engine capacity at our Trenton, Michigan engine plant in order to increase substantially our capacity for four-cylinder engines. We're sold out on our small cars. We're down to a 29-day supply. I don't understand why Ford can't take the actions they have to adjust their product mix to meet the law.
Well, what's your guess? I mean, why do you think they can't?
I don't know. I think they've decided to spend their money to go after the high-margin luxury cars rather than to make the effort it takes to put out a balanced mix that was called for by the Congress.
Ms. Petrauskas, you want to tackle that one again?
I don't know about which of those I ought to take first. Let me take one. The reason we have the extra capacity is because we did it sooner than Chrysler, I guess. Point number two, we would be meeting the standard today if consumers were in fact buying the mix of cars, and I mean medium, small, large, etc., that the government predicted at the time the standard was established. So it's not a question of not having had the foresight to take those actions. It's truly actions that are beyond our control.
How do you think the consumer would be affected, Mr. Miller, if there is a rollback in the standards, if the standards are relaxed? We just heard Ms. Petrauskas say a few minutes ago that there may be a negative impact both on consumers and, of course, on employees of Ford and General Motors if they have to make these changes. But what do you think the effect would be?
I think the effect of a rollback in the standards is that Ford and General Motors will put more of their effort into selling large cars because that's where the profit is. I just wish somebody had come and told us about this 5 years ago when we could have laid in the capacities in order to have put more of our capacity into V8 engines instead of spending the money for the high technology that gets the better fuel mileage on the cars that we've got. We just feel that we've been had by only finding out 90 days before we go into production of the 86 models what the rules are going to be.
Have they been had, Ms. Petrauskas?
I don't think they've been had. Obviously, I can't guess, or I don't even want to speculate as to the reasons why Chrysler decided to abandon the large car market. But, you know, it doesn't take investment to abandon a market. It doesn't take investment to scrap plants. It takes investment to stay in that business. I do know that the last year that Chrysler offered full-size cars, they sold 1,300 of them. They weren't very successful products.
Mr. Miller, she's saying that you weren't successful in the big car market, and that's the reason you're not in that market.
Well, I disagree. We are in that market. We have a car that's a V8 powered car. It's a rear-wheel drive car. It's very similar to what Ford and General Motors sell, and it's called a Fifth Avenue edition. Happens to be somewhat smaller, gets a lot more fuel economy, but it delivers the luxury appeal that they do. We happen to put that vehicle into a smaller plant and therefore have less capacity for it now, but it is still sold out. The reason we went to a smaller plant was in part that we had to make sure that we were continuing to align our capacities to meet the law as we understood it was going to be. But frankly, I'm getting tired of going down to Washington to ask what the law is going to be. I think next time I'm just going to go down to the General Motors and Ford buildings and ask them what it is.
Again, let me ask both of you to try to wrap this up. How is the consumer going to be affected, assuming there is a rollback, as we, of course, heard the administration representative spokeswoman hint that there might be today?
Well, let me answer that. I think if the standards are not rolled back, what you're going to find is that there'll be somewhat higher prices for the luxury cars, and there's going to be a lot better bargains for American cars at the small end, because both General Motors and Ford are going to have to take the marketing actions to be more competitive down at the small end in order to make the standards. So I think the people who could really use that extra bargain when they go out to buy a car are going to get a benefit. That's what would happen to the consumer. If you don't maintain the standards, but instead roll them back, you're going to continue to see what you're seeing today.
Ms. Petrauskas?
I disagree. If the standards are adjusted for the period of time that we've requested, two things are going to happen. Consumers who might otherwise not be able to buy a full-size car will be able to buy a full-size car. From the standpoint of the small cars, I mean, look, when you started this segment, you showed that our fuel economy was at 25.9. If the standard is set at 26, that means we have to sell every single small car that we sell today and then some.
Well,
so the competitiveness of the small car market isn't going to change.
Well, this is one decision that I know the two of you and your respective companies are going to be watching with great interest, and so will we. Helen Petrauskas and Robert Miller, we thank you both for joining us.
Judy, thank you.
Thank you.
Robin?
Again, the major stories of this Tuesday in May. The mayor of Philadelphia said the city would rebuild the 60 houses destroyed in yesterday's police confrontation with a radical Back to Nature group. The police now say 5 bodies have been found in the radical group's house. Secretary of State Schultz and Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko met in Vienna for 6 hours, twice as long as originally scheduled. There was no word on what was discussed or why the meeting went so long. Good night, Jim.
Good night, Robin. We'll see you tomorrow night. I'm Jim Lehrer. Thank you and good night.
The MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is funded by AT&T, reaching out in new directions. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and this station and other public television stations.
Forget to pay your rent last month? Chances are ever getting better that a computer knows and won't forget. Watch tonight at 9 as Frontline addresses the issue of privacy in our time. That's You Are in the Computer, tonight at 9.